Well, hi folks, and welcome to the Old Classic Car channel. Now, if you've been around here a little while, you will remember that I did a video looking at some of the bits and bobs here in the garage, but not the cars. Some of the items that are on shelves, hanging up, etc. Someone did ask for a bit more of info, a bit of background history, if you like, to some of the things that I've hung on to for probably much longer than I really should have done. Items that, for the main, have no real value, but they sometimes have a bit of a story to them, so I thought I would pick a second selection of goodies that are hanging up here in the garage and just talk a little bit about them, why I've still got them, and where relevant, what backstory they have to them. Do they have an interesting tale to tell? Well, I think they probably do, but that's for you to decide. And I'm going to begin with these little items here. Now, I'm going to have to come in a bit closer. These are old Austin of England. Hope you can see that. Austin of England touch-up paints. Yes, exciting times indeed. Do they say that? Yep. So that one is Chelsea Grey. That one is Tweed Grey. Now, I haven't seen any of these before. I'm sure there are one or two around. Tweed Grey, is that's what, Austin A35 colour, I'm thinking probably. And the reason I'm thinking that, and maybe that also applies to this Chelsea Grey as well, but if you know, let me know in the comments. These date back, well, obviously these particular touch-up paints date back to the 1950s, but in particular they take me back personally to a scrapyard in Stockport, which I used to frequent. This would have been in the late 1980s, early 1990s, that kind of time period. And it was one of those great old scrapyards that you could actually walk around in, have a bit of a mooch around, and just see what you could find. I remember it wasn't the best scrapyard in the world, but the time I went in, I think I actually took some photos somewhere. There was the remains of a Thames 400E camper van in there, an Alfa Romeo Junior, and I remember the original hubcaps for that were just chucked inside the car, and how do I wish I had actually retrieved one or more of those. But also in the same scrapyard was an Austin A35. It was a pretty derelict looking Austin A35, and as I mentioned before, going way back to the 1990s, Mrs. OCC ran an Austin A30, the 803cc power car, for a little while as her daily car. And it's funny if it's not something she'd ever wanted to do again since. I'm not sure why. But yeah, we had an A35, A30, and of course I had this A40, which I've had since the beginning of time. And any opportunity to have a bit of a crawl over a small Austin in a scrapyard, well, that was to be grabbed with both hands. And in this little yard there was the remains of an Austin A35. I seem to remember, my memory is a bit hazy, but it wasn't in the best of condition. It was pretty rough, and there was no way it was going to be dragged out and potentially restored. But I remember having a bit of a crawl around in the inside of this car, and in there on the floor pan, possibly under the seat even, were these two old touch-up paints, and I thought, they are definitely coming back home with me. I don't remember what else I bought from this particular yard, but I managed to rescue and hang on to these two original touch-up paints. And like I say, I've not seen any others of these for sale. I mean, saying that, I haven't actually gone looking for any other examples for sale, but I just thought there's a little bit of memorabilia relating to the old Austin Motor Company of the 1950s. Well, I had to save those. Clean surface before applying shake container well, regulate flow by pressure on the brush, and these were made by DJ Tippen Limited, and they even have a British patent number. But yeah, that is pretty cool in my opinion. So yeah, these have been with me ever since then, the probably early 1990s, about 1993, 1994 I would have thought is when I found these in a scrapyard, and they've been here ever since. Oakley dokley, item number 2 in this rogues gallery of things that I probably should have thrown out years ago. And the next item is just on the floor here, so if you'll just excuse me for a moment. And here we have a slightly sad looking fan assembly. Now, if you've been on the Old Classic Car forum going back a few years now, you may well remember this very, very sorry looking fan assembly, and you may have spotted that one of the blades is actually missing, and I've kept this really as a reminder to be very, very careful when around spinning fans under the bonnet of a classic, or in this case a vintage car. This, which you'll note has actually been very poorly repaired at some point in its past. You can see some pretty iffy looking welding going on around here. But this was fitted to the 1924 Dodge Tourer, which I ran for just over 10 years, and that went to a new home a couple of years ago. And I did quite a bit of mileage in that. We went to loads of shows, VSCC runs out around the countryside, all that kind of thing. And one particular day I had it out running on the drive with the bonnet up, engine running, just to make sure everything was behaving itself, as you do with the car. Older the car is, the more time you spend actually checking things to make sure they are still working correctly. And this fan, this complete fan assembly here, was busy whirring round at whatever 1000 RPM it was doing, minding its own business. And yes, at that time, at that very moment in time, it still had 4 blades on it, but that wasn't to be the case for very much longer. We pottered down the road and we stopped at some temporary traffic lights for a few moments, waiting for them to turn green, and then there was suddenly an almighty bang and clouds of steam everywhere, and the whole car started shaking. You could feel the engine vibrating, and I thought, this is bad. This seems very, very bad indeed. And we sort of, I think it was on like a bit of an incline. I think I actually reversed back onto the other side of the road where there was a bit of a cutting on the side of the road, and we raised the bonnet, turned it off, raised the bonnet just to see what was going on, what had gone so catastrophically wrong. And this is what happened. The blade, which is still actually hanging up in there somewhere, the blade had made a bid for freedom, and it had actually flown off, and the engine was running at the time. The blade flew off and impaled itself through the radiator core, which was less than ideal, and that is why there were clouds of steam and everywhere. It was not a pretty sight. The cooling system in the 24 Dodge that we had, it was quite big, because it was a big engine. It was 3.5 litre 4-cylinder, huge big radiator on it, so there was a lot of coolant in there, and of course it was all over the place, sprayed everywhere. It was not a pretty sight at all. And of course, with the fan blade off, it upset the balance of everything, so the engine was sort of shaking, and it was not a good situation at all. But in some respects, obviously, it was bad in so much as the blade came off and went through the radiator, and that was actually repaired. I went over to Wrexham Radiator Services, I think it was called. It was in Wrexham anyway, and they were able to actually fix up and resolder the centre of the radiator core, so I didn't have to replace the entire radiator core, because that would have been a very, very expensive job indeed. So on the one hand, that was quite unlucky, the fact that the blade, which when I actually took a closer look at the fan assembly, had been poorly bodged up when the car lived in Australia, because the car was shipped over new as a knockdown kit of parts to Australia and bodied there. The main body that you actually sat in, the Tourer part, was bodied locally over there. It was a tax reason, I think it was. But yeah, these repairs, these very poor repairs, had been undertaken in Australia, and I hadn't really noticed, to be honest, in all the time that I had it here running and working on it, getting it to run right and putting it on the road here in the UK. But yeah, I was very, very lucky, because only minutes before I had had the bonnet up and the car had been running on the drive, and the blade could so easily have flown off while I had my head under the bonnet looking at the engine to make sure everything was behaving itself. So yeah, it was a bad day, but also a very, very lucky outcome. So it could have been so much worse. So the reason I keep this hanging up in the garage in the Rogues Gallery is to remind me to be very, very wary of any spinning fans, especially spinning fans on very, very old cars. I mean, that car is now 100 years old plus, and even then it was 90, 95 years old, whatever it was. So yeah, be very, very careful if sticking your head under the bonnet of an engine or car with the engine running where it still has the original metal blades, because it's an outside possibility, of course, and it may never happen again to me on any of the cars that we own in future, but it's just made me very, very wary of getting anywhere near these when they are spinning. Right here, so by this point in time you may well have noticed that I'm not very keen on getting rid of things. Yeah, for something to end up in a bin here and actually go, it doesn't happen all that often, I'll be honest. The next item in this house of horrors is this somewhat battered old lamp from the 1920s or 1930s. This actually started out as a French Marshall lamp, and you can probably just about see the Marshall shield in the middle there. But as you can see, this one is looking a little bit second-hand now. Now, why on earth would I keep a lamp in such poor condition? Well, the reasoning is this actually relates to Big Dodge, the big old green truck behind me in the garage over there. And in the 1940s, when it was first built, because it's a 1940 truck put into service probably in 1941, it would have had some fairly large bulbous lamps, and they would have lasted on throughout the war. And after the war it went on to become a truck used for carrying a racing car around different racing circuits. And when I was speaking to one of the team mechanics who used to drive the truck in the late 40s and the 1950s, he actually told me that the lights, the original lights on the Big Dodge, were pretty poor. And they would, sometimes they would be, they were based on the south coast of England. Let me just sort of talk about that. They were situated roughly where the M27 is now, where Roundham services are on the M27 on the south coast of England. That is where Dennis Poor, who owned the Dodge and the Alfa that it used to carry, that's where his whole family estate was. And that was, they actually had it sold, I think it was compulsorily purchased, in fact, when they put the motorway in, whenever that was. But speaking to the chap who used to drive the truck, he said that the original lamps were very inefficient, and they would sometimes do some pretty long epic drives in that truck. They were based way down on the south coast, and often they would go up to Charter Hall in Scotland, or Rest and Be Thankful, the very famous hill climb location way up into the wilds of Scotland. And this was in the pre-motorway era, and yeah, they would probably take several days to get from down there all the way up to Scotland for a hill climb meeting or a race at Charter Hall. Then they'd have to traipse all the way back down using just A and B roads. Like I say, no motorways in those days, in the 40s and the early 1950s, so they would have to try and drive overnight whenever they possibly could. And the original lamps were just very poor by all accounts. They weren't great at all. So they upgraded the truck to Marshall lamps, French Marshall lamps, and apparently these were a lot better, a lot more efficient, even though actually they're probably the diameter of them is slightly smaller than the original lamps that it would have had. But apparently it certainly improved the lighting situation considerably. So even though when you look at Big Dodge and you think those lamps look a little bit funny on there, that is why they are on there, and that is why when the truck was restored, rather than put the original large style lamps on it, which I have got a set which I think are probably right for it, I stuck with Marshall lamps. And this is one of the original lamps, the near side front lamp of Big Dodge when it was used in the late 40s and the early 1950s for carrying what is actually a very famous 1930s Grand Prix Alfa, 2 hill climbs and all that kind of thing in those early post-war years. He was at the first meeting at Goodwood, for example, in 1948. So this lamp came with Big Dodge when we found it in 1995, and clearly it had been broken off somehow, and it was clearly beyond being reused, but I couldn't bring myself to chuck it away. So I actually found at Tatton Park Auto Jumble many years ago, back in the 90s, I actually found someone on the Auto Jumble stall. They had an identical lamp to this, which I grabbed straight away, and that is now on the truck. So one of the lamps on the truck is the original one, the offside front is the original that they put on in the 40s, and the near side front is a replacement to replace this broken, bashed up lamp here. And just as a little extra thing, I just put this down somewhere safely here on the front of the A40. In this article from 1988, which talks about the car and the truck when they were first sort of disinterred following the death of the original owner. If you just come around here and look at this picture here, just on the front wing behind the side light, hope you can see that, there is the lamp, exactly the same lamp. So you can see there was still a lamp on this side which was in perfectly good nick, and that's on the truck now, but this one had broken off, or been broken off at some point. There it is, just sat on the wing, and there it is now. So yeah, it's an original part of the truck. Obviously it was beyond being reused, but I've tried to keep as much of the original fittings and the fabrics of the truck as possible during the restoration, like even all these sign written panels. By the time I found the truck, because it had been left outside for years, it was in a very, very poor state, but I kept all these original sign written panels. They were used when the rear body of the truck was repanelled, and the sign writer guy, he came in and we laid all these original sign written panels out underneath the truck, and he recreated it all onto the new panelling that went on the truck. But I kept all of that just in case, to keep with the truck, just as a nod to its originality. They were way beyond being reused, but at least they live on with the truck and all the spares that I've accumulated over time. So that is why I hung on to this completely worthless old Marshall headlamp from the 1920s or the 1930s. Yeah, pretty ropey. Right, well, I'm sure you're all familiar with these little things, the good old foot pump, and many of them have featured here on the channel over the years. This is a Kismet baby, hopefully you can see that there, and yeah, that's quite a familiar thing, and foot pumps today look very, very similar to this. But going back to the 1920s, things sometimes looked a little bit different. Now, this contraption, which is called the Dead Easy, I'm not sure if you can see that on there, and with a patent date of 1917, came with the 1924 Dodge Tourer that I mentioned before. Now, back in those days, the cars very rarely came with a boot on the back or a trunk to put your bits and bobs in. If you were lucky, you would have a luggage rack and a big trunk on the back, a removable box on the back to put your bits and bobs in. But quite often, all the only places you really had to store stuff was inside the car, which wasn't always ideal, and in fact on the running boards which ran down the side of the car between the front mudguard and the rear mudguards, and they were often pressed into service. Quite often you see them with toolboxes on them or a battery box. Sometimes you could even get like a fold out sort of frame type thing, and you could store luggage behind it on the running board, because basically you had very few options when it came to storing stuff in cars in the 1920s. And when we bought this 20s Dodge, because originally it was shipped over, like I say, to Australia, and it spent most of its life over there, and then came over here about 15 years ago, something like that. There was a dealer who used to bring vehicles in from Australia because they were right-hand drive, so they could easily be sold here in the UK. And on that 24 Dodge that we had, on the running board was this contraption. And at first I had no idea what it was. I thought, well, that looks like a pair of binoculars, but it can't be binoculars because you can't see through it. And it turns out that this is a period tyre inflator. Now, I've not seen one of these before. Apparently it was built, it's just cast into it, the Globe Manufacturing Company somewhere in Michigan, USA. So this was actually built not a million miles away from where the Dodge itself would have been built all those years ago, 100 plus years ago. And this was bolted, or screwed rather, onto one of the running boards, and this would have been your tyre inflator when you're out and about, and if you had a slow puncture, or indeed a proper puncture, and you had to replace the inner tube, this is how you would inflate your tyre. Now, I can only assume that there used to be a bar that went in there, slotted in there, and you would have pumped that up, and then they must have had a really long connector on here with a bit of hose to be able to reach to all four wheels, maybe even a spare in fact on the back, without having to take this off the running board. Now, I've never seen one of these in use. I haven't even tried it, to be honest. I don't know if it actually works, so maybe one day I'll do a little video testing this thing out to see if it still works. But when we got the Dodge back here, like I say, this was going back a little bit now, I just thought, well, it's a lovely looking thing, but I needed the space on the running board to put a toolbox, and I found a lovely old wooden box which looked a little bit rinky-dink. You know, it looked like it was probably 100 years old itself, but it just fitted just fitted really well with the Dodge, and you could open the front door and it just about cleared the box on the running board, so that worked out a treat, and I filled that full of old tools and everything, and that worked really nicely. But to do that I had to take this off, and even though the Dodge is gone, I hung on to this because I've never seen one before, and I could quite easily see me putting this back, say if I buy like a Model A in future or something else vintage. I could probably quite likely fit this to it. But yeah, they're dead easy, and yeah, 1917 patent, what a great thing. Have you got one of these on your car? Have you seen one of these before? Because like I say, I hadn't seen one of these before. I'm not overly familiar with lots of the really early American car accessories. Maybe these sold in quite large numbers, I don't know, but it's a very heavy thing. I mean, this is proper cast iron, and these are chrome, the cylinders here, so it's quite a hefty lump. But yeah, what a great thing. Have you seen one of these before? Let me know in the comments. Okay, and while I'm on the subject of motoring accessories from the olden days, I thought I'd talk again a little bit about, though I mentioned in the previous video that I did in this particular series about the 3 Bedford utes, the PC and JC utes that I bought and brought over from Australia many years ago. And it was around about the time that I owned those 3 utes that I was idly perusing eBay in Australia, as I happened to do quite often at the time. I came across this little accessory which really caught my eye, and I thought someday I've got to use that somewhere. I never actually ended up using it on the Bedford utes, but this is quite a groovy thing, and I'm sure viewers in Australia may well recognise these things. This is a hand turn signal. So whereas over here we tended to have the little pop-up trafficator indicators that were set in often behind the driver and the front passenger door, or on trucks often in little separate boxes on the back of the cab, this was something that was dreamt up in Australia. This was made by a company in, I think, is it Latham or something, in Sydney it says. And because of course flashing indicators weren't really a thing for a very long time. So in the 30s and the 40s, and probably right through into the 50s even, in order to sort of signal your intent to turn at a junction. Of course, if you were turning right in a right-hand drive vehicle like the utes were, you just shove your hand out of the window. But if you want to turn left, not everyone recognises the hand signals, or remembers in fact the hand signals for turning left. So what you would do, you would buy yourself one of these beauties, and that would sit, if you can see that there, that would sit on the door. So you've got the side of the door and the window ledge here, and you would lean across and you would get hold of this, and that tilts up, hopefully you can see that, and that allows you to indicate. That's like that, and that you pull it up and that would allow you to indicate. But not only does it do that, but once it's like that, if you pull on this little knob doofer on the end here, you can do this as well. So you can actually wave at people as you do your turn signal. So I mean, that is pretty groovy. Then when you've done your turn, you would literally just let go and that would bump down, and there you go, and you carry on your merry way. So as accessories go, I thought this was a pretty cool thing. So I bought this and had it shipped over from Australia. Like I said, we're going back to the mid-2000s now, about 2007 maybe, that kind of era. But I just love how it is in the shape of a hand, proper directional indicator made out of metal. And I just think that is such a cool thing. In later years I had thought of maybe using it on the Ford Model AA truck that I had for a little while, but the only downside with it is you have to screw through onto the door to fix it. So that, if you can imagine, you've got these holes here, so they would have to go on the door like that, screwed through there, and then this bit you would have to drill the door skin to mount it that way through there into the side of the door, so that it was firmly affixed, so that you could then lean across from the driver's seat, grab that and do your turn signal. So I never really fancied the idea of drilling into the door to do that, so that kind of put me off fitting it to the AA truck. So it's still here. Now, I did ponder fitting it to the Dodge pickup, but I've yet to figure out a way of fixing this in such a way that it doesn't require drilling into the door, because I'm not doing that. I don't want to drill into the door skin. Of course, back in the 40s and 1950s it didn't really matter. These were just old working pickup trucks and vans and such like, and it may be that these were actually fitted to cars. Have you ever seen one of these fitted in period to perhaps, like I say, the vintage Dodge or something from the 20s, 30s, that kind of era? Anything before flashing turn signals were a thing. Maybe these were also commonly used on cars. Let me know in the comments if they were. But I've seen odd photos of these, old black and white photos, and they've always been fitted to commercial vehicles, so I'm guessing that's the primary market that these were intended for. But yeah, I just think that is one very, very cool period turn signal, and one day I'll get a vehicle that I can fit this to, and in such a way that I don't have to drill the door. At least that's the plan. Right folks, well, the final item for this particular video, let me know if you'd like me to do any more videos like this talking about some of the backstory to the bits and bobs that are hanging up in here, is this. Now, I featured a couple of number plates in the first instalment in this series, and here we have another one, 476 EPA. There we go. And this came with what must be an almost unique old vehicle, just post-war Trojan minibus. It's quite a funny looking thing, to be honest. I bought this quite a few years ago now. I went down to visit a house. I think the family were clearing an old boy's estate. There was all sorts of stuff around in this sort of the land behind his house. And in fact, there were two of these old Trojan minibuses there. One was a little earlier than the other, I think. I think the other one was a bit later, but I bought the earlier of the two. I think I've got that the right way around. But this was a spare number plate that came with it. And the family told me that they used this Trojan for family holidays and so on. It must have been really slow. I think it was diesel. I didn't actually ever get it running, but I think it was a diesel powered thing. Like I say, I'm going back a little bit now, so my memory is a little hazy on the specifics, but I know they used to tow a big camping trailer behind it, and this is what they used to hang on the camping trailer whenever they went on these expeditions to distant lands across the country. So 476 FPA. If I think on, I'll look up and find out what date that particular registration actually dates to see what age that vehicle was. I can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, that's off. Well, it's quite a, I mean, it must be seriously unusual now. I remember, I think it was Dinky, they did a whole range of these little, quite snub-nosed little Trojans, the vans and the little minibus as well that it was based on. But survivors of the real vehicle must be very, very thin on the ground. I often wonder what happened to the one that I bought those years ago. But what really appealed to me about this number plate is, if we have a look a little bit closer, you can see it's been made up in sections. So you've got the 47, then we've got a 6 here, and they've all been riveted to the back plate. Then we have an F, and then we have PA. So clearly the enterprising owner of this Trojan, going back a bit, he decided that he wanted a number plate, but he wasn't going to go and pay the local motor accessory shop to make up a number plate for him. No, he must have gone down to the local scrapyard and simply gone around looking at all the cars and vehicles in the scrapyard and removed the number plates, any number plates that had a letter or number that applied to the Trojan that he had, and he must have chopped them up and made up this number plate using all these donor number plates, which I think is really, really cool. That's a great idea. I've never seen anyone do that before, and I haven't seen anyone do it since, to be honest, but I just think that's a great idea. So that's how he made up this original plate to put on his camping trailer, probably in the 1950s, I would have thought. So I just think that's really, really cool. So, and one thing I meant to say is, if you've been watching the video and if you've made it this far, well, thank you so much for making it this far. Please give it a like, leave a comment. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please give it a sub. And yeah, and talking of comments, maybe you've got some interesting bits and bobs hanging up in your garage which on the face of it aren't really that interesting, but actually have an interesting little backstory to them, and that'd be great to hear about that. And if you've got any collections that you would perhaps be okay for me to come and visit and do a video about, please let me know. Maybe drop me a line through the Old Classic Car website, oldclassiccar.altogether.co.uk. There is a contact me page on there, because I love featuring this sort of slightly more oddball stuff that on the face of it you just think, well, what's that? No one knows what it is, but if there's a backstory to something, I think that just really brings it alive and makes it a whole lot more interesting. So anyway, I think those items will wrap up this second instalment of looking at some of the junk and bits and bobs that are hanging up in here, which on the face of it should have probably ended up in a skip many years ago. So thank you for watching. Please give it a like, comment, subscribe, all that kind of thing. I'll leave some links to similar videos at the end of this one if you like this kind of thing, and there'll be loads more videos along very soon. So bye for now. I'll go and hang this up again now.